Hi, everyone. um, I don't want this lecture to be too long today, but I do want to take some time to introduce you to some studies of interstate conflict and some studies of group conflict just generally, and to get you thinking both about how we would study conflict scientifically and on some of the questions and some of the approaches associated with studying organized political conflict. So I'm going to go over some of those discussions in this talk. And then you have the other recording from Stephen Soroka talking about the correlates of war data. I have some of the correlates of war descriptive statistics in this presentation, but I'm not going to go over them right now. I'm going to allow Stephen to do that. Also, I hope you all have completed your exam and you're not too burnt out. But because I'm assuming that you may be burnt out given that you just went through the exam and this is such a compressed period, I'm going to try to keep this one shorter. I'm going to try. Hopefully I do. Okay, so let me pull up the slides for today. So again, what we want to discuss today is just some patterns in global conflict. The first block of instruction in this course was really talking about the American foreign policy establishment. This is supposed to talk about how foreign policy in the US is made, how policy is made in times of crises, what the incentives are of the political leaders that make these decisions in crises, presidencies, and retention, and what assets are at their disposal. So, given all of that, what we want to understand is how is it that a country like the United States, how does it find itself involved in global conflict, and what are some of the empirical patterns we see in global conflict, and how, again, does the United States fit into this? I think a big thing to remember also is that in the post-war era, the United States initiates more interstate conflicts than any other country, right? It is, again, rightly or wrongly, we can make our own judgments on that, but the United States initiates more conflicts than anyone. So if that's true, it makes sense to try and understand some of the patterns that are that we observe in global conflict, both in the post-war period and before, just so we can get a handle on what this phenomenon is scientifically. And in the second block, we're going to devote quite a bit of time to try to understand why is it that we see war? Why is it that we see armed conflict? And what are some of the motivations for a country like the United States to initiate these conflicts? And also talk about how the United States has risen to its status as a result of the largest conflict the world has seen, which is World War II. So again, today what we want to do is to try to discuss a couple of different things. We want to talk about how violence and organized violence has evolved. We also want to talk about this debate between nature versus nurture of violence. There's some argument that people are born violent. There's another argument that people are nurtured into violence, that they experience a whole bunch of traumas that leads them to engage in violence. And then given all that, we want to discuss some of the patterns in international conflict. So first thing to do is to try to define what we mean by political warfare. Again, this course is on peace, war, and defense, so we want to understand this violence as war. What we're not really interested in are something like just homicides or hate crimes or something like that. What we're interested in is war, which is a political form of conflict. There are three key aspects of war that we think about when we're talking about political conflict. The first is it involves the use of power, which is the ability of one entity to coerce another actor into doing something they otherwise would not. So if two entities want to cooperate, if two entities want to share water, if that's what they choose to do, then no power is exercised. But if one entity does not want to share and another one compels them to do that, that's the use of power. So a key aspect of political war is it involves power, the use of power. A second aspect of this is that it's systematic. Political conflict has to be some organized activity. It can't be random, right? It's intended to have some systematic component to it, right? So organized armies fight each other in a systematic way. There's an intent behind it. There's a goal behind it. They're trying to achieve an outcome. It's not just random homicides or mob violence. And then finally, the third aspect of it is that there is some violence attached to it. It's not just political insults. It's not just political competition. There actually is some violence, and actors suffer and property or materials are destroyed as a result of this. Now, the question is this behavior unique to human beings? Are humans the only species that engages in war? For quite some time, it was believed that humans were the only entity that did engage in war. But as we see more research being done amongst biologists and amongst anthropologists, we can see that there are other species that seem to be engaging in what looks like organized political violence. We can see this with some human beings, primates, in terms of some primate ancestors of human beings, and some of our biological relatives, like apes and chimpanzees, seem to engage in territorial conflict. We also see our species like ants and engaging in what looks like organized political conflict. If we look at it, it looks like these are efforts to try to exert power over one side or the other to control food supplies and to perpetuate species. So they look like they could be considered wars. I think what we can understand, because we can't interview our subjects here and we can't get their intent, though you could do this to some extent with apes and chimpanzees, the ones that are engaging in war are unlikely to be in the lab to talk to, is we can't identify, is this systematic or is this random? It looks to be systematic, but that's really just observations. And so we're inferring from that that looks like a war. It's difficult to decipher that intent from animals. It looks like it, right? But we're not really exactly sure. So the question is, why would we see violence among species? This is an interesting behavior, right? It's a terrible behavior. But when we think about human beings biologically, what we assume is that the purpose of the species is to perpetuate itself, right? That's from evolutionary biology. Going to war seems to fly in the face of all of that. Going to war destroys things. Going to war destroys your own fellow species. So why would you do such a thing, right? Well, there's a couple of different explanations that are proposed from different fields. First, from biology and anthropology, there's an argument for fitness advantages, that by going to war, humans are able to root out those that are weaker. And so from an evolutionary perspective, the human species will become stronger. That's a fitness advantage. A second one is that from psychology is that violence provides some form of emotional release or some form of emotional reward. We do see this, right, that humans do tend to enjoy some aspects of violence. So the argument there is that there is some emotional release attached to it, that there's some enjoyment from it. We can see some of that, but that tends to be more individually based. A third argument is from sociology, economics, political science, and to some extent history, which is an argument that war is intended to acquire tangible goods or scarce resources. So we can think about wars for oil, or we can think about wars for water, or we can think about wars for territorial control, where the territory itself is valuable farmland or something like that. Those are the pursuit of scarce resources, with the argument being that if there was an infinite supply of oil or an infinite supply of food or water, there would be no need for these wars. But because humans are competing over that one scarce resource, we can sometimes see armed conflict. And then finally, we see wars, arguments for wars, that they're intended to heighten the solidarity of groups. A famous sociologist, historian, and political scientist, you could consider him all these, and Charles Tilly argued that war made the state, but the state makes war, right? Which is the argument being that threats are what made, or basically justify the modern state, that the state is organized to protect people, and it can only protect people if there's something to protect them from, and that something to protect them from are other human beings and the threat of war from other human beings. So that's intended to heighten solidarity. You can also think about this in terms of ethnic conflict, right? So what might define, just as an example of this, my background is from India. One of the key aspects of what defines an Indian is that an Indian is different than a Pakistani, even though in the United States we're all basically treated the same, right? There's really no difference between us. But in the Indian subcontinent, there clearly is a difference. And so what defines me as an Indian there is that I am not a Pakistani, and what defines a Pakistani is that they are not an Indian, right? Even though we're biologically the same, that difference and that rivalry is what defines us. And so that heightens the solidarity of these groups, because Pakistanis must fear Indians. It heightens the solidarity of Pakistanis and vice versa. So what that means is that in order for that kind of dynamic to work, there has to be a way of identifying another. So we know that human beings biologically seem to form groups Oftentimes these groups are based on family ties, extended family ties, etc., which allows for this thing called culture to start to emerge. Now, for a long time, there was a belief that culture was unique to humans, though we are seeing more evidence against this, right? We're seeing that, again, in some primate species, that there does seem to be some culture that gets passed down. But the idea behind culture is it's some set of customs, some set of norms, some set of institutions that are passed down from one generation to the next. So it allows for a continuation of a society, right? The culture defines the society, the set of symbols define the society. They're passed down from one generation to the next. And so one thing that has to happen for a culture to actually survive is it has to distinguish itself. It has to demonstrate that it has an advantage. It has to demonstrate that it has its appeal. So it has to distinguish itself from others in order for it to be unique. Take the American experience. One thing that defines the American experience and has long defined the American experience is that the American experiment has been one in democracy. That is different than most states that were created and most states that existed at the same time of the United States. The United States was the democracy. The United States has been a force for democracy. That's a tradition that's been passed down from generation to generation. But that is not unique, and that does not uniquely define America and the American experience unless there are non-democracies in the world. So that means you have to have that other, that non-democracy in the world for that culture of the United States, that democratic culture in the United States, to mean anything. Right, and this is interesting because oftentimes when we look at these different cultures that are out there, there's divergence in interest based on circumstances. Humans may want different things than others, right? And so that allows for this creation of these others, since it allows for the othering of other groups. These differences, though, allow for individuals to start identifying individuals as something other than themselves, right? So I can say that that culture, a particular culture, might prefer polytheism, whereas my culture prefers monotheism. I prefer my culture. The individuals that are polytheistic might prefer their culture. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But in essence, there is some competition there, right? If I think my culture is better, I prefer monotheism since monotheism populates the world where polytheism does not. And to some extent, if those differences become heightened, there might be an incentive to start to challenge each other to grow monotheism as opposed to polytheism. So these differences can start to promote competition. Now, on one hand, fine, it's not a big deal. The competition can be over who people want to worship, how people want to worship, and that's totally fine, right? And it can be a competition of ideas, and there's nothing wrong with that. At its most extreme forms, though, this can result in violence. So these differences and this othering are not a direct cause of war, nor are they sufficient to produce war, nor are they sufficient to produce violence, but they may be necessary to provoke political violence, right? So it's not the case that differences in culture, differences in politics, differences in beliefs, anything like that will cause war. They are not sufficient to cause war, but you need those differences to actually have a conflict, because if you didn't, there would be no political conflict. So they are a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. So think about how identities might form. One way you can think about this is think about your identity at UNC. Right now, you probably identify yourself as a Tar Heel, right? And when you graduate, UNC will go out of its way to make sure you hold on to that identity, right? You'll see pictures like this. You'll see lots of memorabilia coming to remind you about your wonderful experiences at UNC, and they will often come with something encouraging you to give generously to UNC. You should do that, I guess. I'm joking. But you should, again, the idea is to try to make you think that there is something special about this place in Chapel Hill, UNC, and the identity as a Tar Heel. Now, how do you identify that? Well, if you just identify as someone that's college educated, you're no different than any other individual that's been educated at any other college, right? You're just the same as a Michigan Wolverine. You're the same as an Ohio State Buckeye. You're the same as a Blue Devil from Duke. But if I say being at UNC is something unique and something special, and it differentiates you from someone that was educated at that university down the road and a Blue Devil, your identity as a Tar Heel means that you are somehow have some superiority to those other groups. As someone that is at UNC, I want you to think that. I want you to enjoy UNC. I want you to be proud of that. But that means that I have to get you to think that you're better, right? If my job has been done right, if everyone's job has been done right, you'll adopt this identity. At the macro level, you're all college educated, but I'm somehow convincing you that the identity as a Tar Heel is better. And so If you do that, you identify yourself as who you are by who you are not, and you start to develop some idea that you have some superiority based on who you are in comparison to who you are not. Now, that's the same idea of how you would build nationality, right, and national ethnic differences. I believe that I am superior because, say, for example, I am a Muslim compared to somebody else. I don't actually believe that, right? But that's the idea how you build that's an idea of how you can build nationality. I believe that Sunni Islam is the true way of doing that. And if you're a Shiite Islam, if you practice that, you're somehow inferior. You're an apostate. That doesn't mean that I have to produce violence, but there can be a tendency to say that if you're from the Shiite group as opposed to the Sunni group, you are somehow inferior. Flip that around, the same thing would be done from the Shiite group to the Sunni group. Same thing can be done between Catholics and Protestants, right? That's the idea, is that my group is somehow better, and it defines me that I am not the other group. I am not part of the apostates. So the question is this uniquely human to do? Is this driven by all species? We don't know that because we can't interview them. We can see it in humans. So we can't necessarily say if this othering is something that other species do. We can only see it in humans. We can see political conflict in other species, or we can see conflict in other species, organized conflict in other species. We don't know if it's political, and we don't know if it's a product of this othering, right? So what we start to see is that to survive nature's difficulties, humans start to develop their culture so they can preserve themselves, pass their traditions down, and then they start to organize into societies, right? These cooperation and formation of organizations produce some efficiency, right, that improved every individual's chance of survival. A human being was better off being part of a pack than going out on their own. Some did go out on their own and did just fine, but the overall probability of survival in a human being was higher if they were part of a pack, right? We do see, if that's the case, right, that there was some competition between these early organizations. What we can see is oftentimes there needed to be people that were sacrificed to animals that would attack the pack, or there were people that had to sacrifice if there was a shortage of food. By conquering other people, you could identify those individuals that could be sacrificed, right, or could be turned into slaves or whatever it may be, right? And so those were the foundations of some of these social organizations. So the theory is that early conflict was really a response to human predators. Predators would threaten tribes. Humans would therefore need sacrifices who would appease these aggressors, and therefore these sacrifices to gods and other things would come from people you conquered, right? And so once these individuals could organize, they could preserve an in-group and sacrifice an out-group, right? That was an idea of why early conflicts started to emerge. And so the question is this natural? This really depends on how you view the world, right? Do you view the world as based at the individual level, or do you view the world as holistically? Right. An individual level explanation would argue that hatred and violence and othering, those are choices. Those are individual choices. That happens to be what I believe, right? The other way you look at it, the holistic way, is that these differences between groups of people are natural, right? And that's just the way these are. Some groups are just different than others. I happen to believe when you look at two groups and they seem different than others, that is a product of individual choices and a function of history. So Sunnis and Shiites became different because of choices that were made early on in their evolution, and those institutionalized over time. I don't think that that's natural, right? I just don't believe that, right? So this leads to this debate of nature versus nurture. Again, I would encourage you to think about this and come up with your own ideas, and be skeptical. The idea here is that are humans possibly born violent, or are they made violent? And if you think about that, that's a critical distinction. If a human being is born violent, there's not much that can be done to prevent violence. Now, we know some people are born violent. We know, for example, that somewhere between 3 to 5% of the population is born with psychopathy, or maybe sociopathy, right? So we know that, but not everyone within the psychopathy or within the sociopathy pools are violent. Some of them are. So a small percentage of society may be born violent. We know that. If that's the case, we could argue that mass violence is a product of these individuals, but that's kind of strange because what we know is that when mass violence happens, lots of people participate in it, and lots of people participating in it happily, right? And lots of people participate in it willingly, right? For example, if we look at Nazi Germany, not everybody who was in Germany was a psychopath or a sociopath, but many people that were not participated in that violence. So the next question is, if you're made violent, there may be points of intervention that could stop the process along the way, right? So again, we can think about these two distinctions. Psychopaths are people that are born with predispositions to violence. Again, if you are a violent psychopath, put that asterisk there because not all psychopaths are violent. If you're a violent sociopath, you develop violent tendencies in response to the social environment. Scientists tend to estimate that both disorders occur within the population. 1% of the population is psychopathic, while about 3% is sociopathic. Not everyone in those pools are violent. And so there's a small group of people that actually are just predisposed to violence, right? That just engage in violence for violence's sake. And so if we think about that, that creates an interesting observation for us. What this suggests is that the vast majority of people out there are not violent. I want to say that again. The vast majority of people that are out there are not violent. Yet when you see something like war, a significant number of people who are not naturally violent are engaging in horrific acts of violence against their own species. And we know that these things can have very quick onsets. Like if we think about just time, people become mobilized very quickly. People can develop hatreds very quickly against their own biological kin, right? Which again is a really interesting problem if you think about it from the biological angle. So think about Nazi Germany as an example of this. Why is it that this group of human beings chose to try to exterminate other human beings? Their argument was that there's something ethnically different about the individuals that they tried to exterminate. Jews, Poles, Slavs, Russians, etc. Something different about them. Biologically, there's none. Culturally, there is. Biologically, there's none. So they're engaging in something that looks like very anti-evolutionary behavior, right? And their willingness to do that evolved very, very quickly. Why? That is an interesting puzzle. Why? Why are they willing to do that? Similar behavior in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. People that once identified themselves as country people, right, as having the same nationality of Yugoslavia, quickly devolved into these groups of Croats, of Slovenes, of Serbs, and Muslims, and turned on each other and started to engage in atrocious acts of violence. In Rwanda, you had significant intermarrying between Hutu and Tutsi, and by many, many estimates, it looks like those definitions were basically imposed by a foreign power. They didn't even naturally exist. And yet you saw those groups kill each other at very, very high rates. In Rwanda, the rate of killing was equivalent or faster than the rate of killing in Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany had a machine where Rwanda was being done by machete. So the othering is something that clearly seems to have an influence on people's willingness to harm each other, even though biologically there's just nothing to that, right? Which again is quite interesting. So a couple of things we can observe. One is that violence isn't normal. If we look at the world in sort of a long perspective, we see that interstate wars are rare. Incidents of mass violence tend to be rare. It doesn't seem to be normal. When it does happen, it's typically in response to shocks, and there's only a small fraction of the population that seems predisposed to it. When it does occur, what we can see is it can grow to very, very large proportions. It can get very, very big. So we want to be able to answer the questions as we go through this. How does war happen? When does it happen? And what can be done to stop it, right? Those are key questions we want to understand when we look at interstate conflict, because interstate conflict is a rare form of conflict. It doesn't tend to escalate to very large proportions very often, but when it does, when you see something like World War I and World War II, those were the worst conflicts humanity had ever seen. And when we think about the possibility that the Cold War became a hot war, that would have exterminated humanity. So these are the type of wars that can be fatal for the species. For that reason, we do want to be able to understand it a bit more carefully, especially because, again, the United States is the country that does this the most, right? So we do want to be able to understand why this is happening. So we're going to start our analysis with understanding international wars, and we're going to focus that up for this week. There are several reasons to justify that. One, states are the most deadly practitioners of violence. They're much more violent and they have much more capability than rebel groups or terrorist groups. They have the deadliest weapons. They have the most individuals at their disposal. They can marshal armies a lot faster. They can marshal resources a lot faster. And so wars between states are going to be very, very deadly. So the question is, what do we know about those conflicts? So for that, right, we can think about how we learned about those conflicts. Early studies of war were just descriptive, right? They focused on one conflict. They focused on describing that one conflict, and they identified a whole bunch of variables for why, right? Power imbalances, alliances, psychopathy of the leaders. But what they didn't identify was causation. They're describing what happened. For example, if you make the case that World War II was caused by Hitler's psychopathy, why did it start at the time that it did? Why didn't it happen earlier, right? Why wasn't he engaging in war all the time? And he wasn't, right? We have to be able to understand that if it's a function of just the psychopathy, there should be war all the time, right? But there just frankly wasn't. So in order to understand war, we have to understand the conditions under which it does occur and the conditions under which it does not. We have to be able to analyze why and why not. That's how we would do this scientifically. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn you over to Stephen Soroka to try to describe the correlates of war data, which were the first attempt to scientifically study war. They were housed at the University of Michigan. I will turn it over to him. And we will begin our discussion of the causes of war tomorrow.